Hello, everybody. Vince Venturella here. I just wanted to take a few quick moments before I head out for the holiday to record a video, sort of a response video to something Anthony posted, I think, last week. So the Sustainable Center threw up a video about should game rules be free, and I thought he covered a lot of nice topics, and I thought it was a very good exploration of sort of that concept. But I have a slightly different take on it, and I wanted to have a short video kind of explaining my perception of the thing. As I mentioned in previous videos, I'm an RPG designer and I've worked for both. I've published books myself as well as consulted for other larger companies. And the concept of free rules is something that has been around in the role playing game space for quite a while now and has been a major topic of conversation for about the last 15 years. And so I kind of wanted to look at it through that lens and walk through that and talk about what we could bring back to Warhammer and what could be the potential. So before I get into that, I want to talk about a funny idiosyncrasy of game mechanics. So game mechanics are not a copyrightable thing. You can, in some cases, they can be patented, but that's a much higher bar. Game mechanics in general cannot be copyrighted, just due to an idiosyncrasy of U.S. patent trademark law. You can copyright story, you can copyright characters, so I can't knock off somebody's world, but I can steal their mechanics. So, like, if the mechanic I want to steal is we compare two abilities like weapon skill or something and roll and I generate a hit, that's not a copyrightable thing. I can take that mechanic and use it in my own game, theoretically. What you can copyright is, if anybody remembers the second edition Dungeons and Dragons game, there was a saving throw chart in there. And if you remember that chart, it seemed to be a very odd sort of set of numbers where, basically it looked like a lot of darts were thrown at numbers. They didn't have an algorithmic way to define them. The only way you knew the save of a certain level, if you didn't have it memorized, was to go and look at that chart. That kind of thing can be copyrighted because it's considered sort of creative content and it's not mathematically or algorithmically created. Whereas if you take something like third edition D&D and you take the ability score modifiers for that, where it's a very simple, straightforward algorithm to get at what the ability score modifier is based on the ability score, that cannot be copyrighted. So in other words, I can mathematically derive that modifier. If your score is 10 or your score is 5,240,312, I can tell you what the modifier is. Okay? I don't need a table. Now, they still put a table in the book, but I don't need it. That kind of mathematical game mechanic cannot be copyrighted. So you might ask, well, then why don't we see knockoff games everywhere? Well, one, you do. If you look back at like the 70s, 80s, to a lesser degree the 90s, what you see is a lot of inbreeding and people borrowing each other's mechanics and taking from them because it is a legitimate thing to do. Now, at the same time, just because it's legal doesn't mean you can't be brought to court for it or that litigation couldn't result. So, and if you're a small company publishing a knockoff game and you get, sort of a cease and desist letter from a big house, from a big game company, your best idea is probably just to shut down and stop what you're doing. Because it's very expensive to go to court. That big company has a legal department that gets paid literally to do this thing. So they're going to beat you simply by draining your funds. So that's one of the reasons why people don't do it. That being said, there are several well-known examples within the RPG community where the people publishing the game books actually were lawyers and were more than happy to go to court and would win. Because it was their own time and they knew the legal system and could represent themselves. And so what did they care? And they did win. So one might think that a way to defend yourself against this is to simply make your rules free. If they're going to get stolen, if they're going to get taken anyways, why not make them free? This has become more apparent with the consumer in the last 10 years where now you can get a copy of anything you want, anytime you want on the internet if you're willing to, fish around on torrent sites long enough. I'm pretty sure you can find a copy of any, tabletop or RPG book published from 1974 through today in PDF format within a couple minutes of clever searching. So, staring down sort of that situation, in 2001, Wizards of the Coast made a very bold decision under a man named Ryan Dancy and Peter Atkinson, their CEO at that time. They decided to publish 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons under the open game license. And that's, I'm sure we're all familiar with Creative Commons and stuff like that with open source things. It's the open source movement brought into game design. The idea that those mechanics, since they can't be copyrighted, make them available to everyone. Not just the players could get their hands on it for free, but legitimizing everybody else using them to design. It's a very important distinction. What they were effectively allowing is any game company that they wanted to use D&D's rules to make a D&D book. And that sounds like suicide as a company, because you are allowing anyone to use your brand. Now, there's a very small moral clause in there that allows them to object, but it's pretty weak, honestly. Okay? And the OGL, because of the way it's written, cannot be revoked. So it is legal until the U.S. legal system no longer exists. So for the foreseeable future, hopefully. So what happened as a result of that? Well, what happened is D&D became the only game in town. Because overnight, basically, a ton of companies sprang up and started publishing D&D books. Everybody was making and playing D&D. And what a lot of groups did was say, okay, we're going to stick to the core published by Wizards, and that's all legit. And then we're going to search, and if you as the player or myself as the GM wants to pick one of these other things from somewhere else, then we will use those things we really like and bring them into our game. And it allowed people to explore concepts and have rules that maybe Wizards didn't have time to publish because they can only publish so many books. And it let people construct their games the way they wanted. The other interesting thing that happened is Wizards and D&D grew. You might think that by having a bunch of other people using your brand and publishing what's basically your game would lower your sales. But in fact, exactly the opposite happened. By all financial records we have, it was explosively successful. Okay? The market share, because it grew the total market. The interest in it was huge, and hence there were more people wanting to buy. And even if only 60% or 50% of those people that came into the market actually bought Wizards products, that whole additional 50% that did were customers they didn't have before at all. And wouldn't have had it not been for the growth in the market. Okay? So, what's key here? What's key here is that by making the rules free, they allowed players to get the basic rules for free. Not the books. You still got to pay for a physical book, of course, because that has printing costs and such. But the basic rules in a digital format. And they let publishers use it for free. So there's no concerns of litigation coming back on you or something like that. And the market grew tremendously. Some might say, honestly, to a detriment, because it was such a big bubble. Okay? But probably a more in-depth topic for another time. So why am I talking about the history of the OGL when it comes to Warhammer? Well, this is why. In 2000, D&D as a brand was pretty heavily damaged. It had gone through a rough patch, transferring from TSR to Wizards. It had a lot of contenders to the throne. And for the first time since role-playing games were basically started in the mid-70s, D&D was not the preeminent role-playing game. And this really was the first time that had happened. Year over year, D&D was always the #1 game. Okay. But there were a lot of competitors to the throne, and the brand had been damaged by the company that owned it. I think you can see the analogy I'm drawing here. Right now, GW and Warhammer, there are a lot of contenders to the throne, and there's some damage from the brand from decisions that Games Workshop has made. You're never going to make everybody happy all the time, but they probably could have made some decisions better some of the time. So my proposition is to take what Anthony said and go a step farther. I don't just want to see the rules and the basic rules free for a player. I would love to live in a world where Games Workshop made the rules open source for other companies. So those other companies that are out there basically making GW figs and basically making Warhammer, which they exist, okay, could be brought under the umbrella of Warhammer. Now, they don't have to be. They can still make their own game. But it legitimizes them if they want to. And if history repeats itself, and we have a fair amount of reason to believe it would, the result would not be the end of GW or something like that. It would be a tremendous growth and rebounding. The solution to their financial problems may be in not charging more for figs and more for books and special events, all of which might help in the short run, but in making their product free to players and designers, and then by association, making it the preeminent name in gaming, in tabletop wargaming, again. Because overnight, companies would want to get in on that business. There's a huge market there, and the market would self-reinforce and grow. Now, could it bubble again? Yeah, sure, and there could be downsides. It would have to, but if they learned the lessons of Wizards well, then they could avoid a lot of pitfalls. For example, one of the pitfalls with 3rd edition D&D was it was not as rigorously play-tested as it might have otherwise been, and so they had to do 3.5, which then invalidated thousands of books that had been published under 3.0, and companies overnight went out of business. Games Workshop, I've talked in the past how, unlike D&D, which every edition sort of tends to completely reinvent its rules, Games Workshop has just been honing the knife. The core of what Warhammer is has been the same since very early editions. And every edition, they've basically been sharpening it to the point where now, I think most players agree 8th edition is probably the best edition of Warhammer ever. There might be tiny individual elements of older editions you like, but if taken in the aggregate, I think the general consensus is this is sort of a golden age of rules in Warhammer, because they've spent 8 editions sharpening the knife, just sharpening the knife. So this is a great time to strike with that, to set those, to solid gold print those rules, or to make some small changes and then solid gold print the rules, whatever that happens to look like. What would that mean if everybody came in? Well, for tournaments, obviously tournaments would just stick to the core, what GW publishes. But for everybody else playing in their basement, their garage, they would have this huge other legitimate amount of resources. We already have these fan books out there. Well, now they could be legitimized. And more would be made. You could have different armies and dogs of war and explorations of different corners of the Warhammer world and societies that you don't normally get to see. It doesn't need to be just about the stock standard stuff. But it's all feeding back to GW, reinforcing the Warhammer message. Are there downsides to this? Yes, obviously. And they would need to be considered. But I think that that is an interesting proposition, that their salvation lies in making things free, not in making things more expensive, ironically. So my final thought on this is, do I think Games Workshop would ever do this? No, not in a million years. It's a pipe dream, to say the least. But I think it's a neat idea to ruminate on, and it's what Anthony's video put me in the mind of. I'll include the link to Anthony's original video below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it and what you think. Leave those below. And thank you very much. And if you're watching this before Christmas, have a Merry Christmas. If you're watching it after, I hope you had a happy holidays. Thank you much, everybody. Have a great one.